Stella, Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. And shall we kick off with a question?
Yes, let's kick off with a question.
Let's start with a question.
How did you first meet my dad? There's a question. I bet you don't remember, do you?
Well, there's the question asked and answered. Okay, well, move on to that. For those of you who know the 60s and subsequent decades, you'll know that after a while, a fog of memory sets in. So my fog of memory has been setting in for 20 years, which is why teacher habits die hard. I have some notes, so I'm fair to at least the quotes that I want to give. Got some William Blake quotes for you, got some Jeff Keane quotes for you, got some Jim Duke quotes for you, and some Richard Cupidi quotes. That's my surname in case you didn't catch it in the introduction. And the thing about Brighton, by the way, don't let the accent fool you. I've lived in Brighton longer than many of you have been alive, because I came down here for the weekend.
That's what they all say.
Well, I can be responsible for everyone, but in my case, I came down here for the weekend on a Sunday, and it was typical Brighton. Your dad wasn't involved that day, but he became involved later on. I came down for an interview, and not very far from here, and the door opened, and a very tall man in a very short kimono that came just about to the top of his testicles opened the door and said, hello, how are you? I am fine, are you gay? And that was the start of our conversation.
That's quite an intro. Was that Bill Butler by
That
any
was
chance?
Bill Butler, who was the founder of the Unicorn, that starting the next day, I came back and managed, okay, for 2.5 years. Hence the Ballard quote that for some of you who are here, that was one of the things we published. Anyway, by the way, I responded, I'm fine, I'm glad you're fine, and I'm more or less straight, but I'm always open to persuasion. And we had an interview on the doorstep, and I started work the next day. That was Brighton. So trying to remember your father, who was, looking at this artwork, and for those of you who've seen his films, you must have imagined a fireworks on legs. Jeff was the quietest, most soft-spoken, most unassuming man. He could come across at a distance like a retired vicar or civil servant. Jeff, that's just a rough metaphor, okay. And
Yes.
he used language very sparingly. I never had an experience where he raised his voice.
No, God, no.
And
No. And he was very slow moving as well, wasn't he? He was quite very calm and
nothing like
reserved and
Dr. Gaz,
I know,
nothing
completely
like
the
Gaz
opposite.
works, or so on. It's not that there's an alter ego there. There is just a different way of experiencing the process. So that was Jeff in the process. And when we first met, I have no recollection.
No.
I do.
So you didn't meet in Better Books beforehand up in London, because you were involved in Better Books before you got involved in Unicorn.
I was involved in Better Books only as I'm afraid that this is recording. Could we have a little glitch here? If you take one thing away from Jeff's films, is that there are multiple stories that happen simultaneously, and you can't disentangle them without losing parts of them. So there's a little bit of context. It carries on down here as well. So let's just say that haze that we talked about of place at the time, Brighton was definitely that. I mean, the tabloids would have you believe one thing. It was only a singular truth. There was everything else going on. When I first came to Brighton, which was, I think, in 1968.
Was it? Yeah.
It was absolute, I fell in love with it. Literally, I fell in love with it instantaneously, because it was absolutely founded on unbridled creativity, a fascinating transgression, not transgressions for its own sake, but it was basically, well, fuck that. And everything else was posited on that. So your dad, the first memory that I have, I think, is being bare-assed on the beach down towards Black Rock doing some stuff with boats, okay? And I spent the weekend going through some of his films looking for the famous cheat shop. I haven't found it yet, but it's there. Or else we were in Sheepcoat Valley, which is a huge skip here, because Jeff would film not only for the detritus that people didn't want, but because it was a special place that didn't have any buildings, that didn't have any obligations, didn't have any architecture, it didn't have any owners, except in the broadest sense. Brighton Council would wash their hands of it if they could, because it was a dumping ground. By the way, one thing I actually, it's not an argument, but I criticized your dad for. I just said, do you know what, Jeff? With you around, there's an incredible shortage of dolls and blowtorches. Because he just basically...
And jelly.
Oh yeah, I never
Lots of
thought
jelly.
about jelly. I never looked for that. But Brighton was stripped of dolls and blowtorches for the longest time because they would be part of the intensity, the deconstruction of how he worked, and the reconstruction of how he worked. Anyway, I think the first encounters would have been in him rounding up people, probably when I worked at the Unicorn.
Yeah, because I thought he must have, because he was friends with Bill Butler and all that from Better Books beforehand.
Yeah, he would wander down and go, does anyone want to come and film? Or something like that, incredibly quiet. And if you didn't know him, you'd think, no, just say yes. At that time, Brighton was a place where you said yes to everything. Okay? People, strangers came up to the street, made propositions, you go yes, and you'd find out. And of course, I'm exaggerating, but the beauty of it is that these things were absolutely possible. Brighton has a long history in that. Aubrey Beardsley, Alistair Crowley, and a whole bunch of other people thrown in between. So that creative maelstrom, which I first encountered when I came here, Jeff was part of that. Not the maelstrom part that talked up what he did, but the actual fact that he did so incredibly much. By the way, this is a really long answer to your short question. By the way, one of the things, I've spent the weekend thinking about this, which is why the invitation from John, even though I mildly take the piss out of the camera person, this is John's gallery, John and his wife's gallery, and they've made it possible. Stella has been the curator and protector of Jeff's legacy, the physical material and artifacts. So we have her to thank that these things have survived, and they've given me this invitation to revisit some of the stuff, this stuff, and the Brighton context stuff, not out of nostalgia, out of creative continuity with the stuff going on. Places like this could have been 50 years ago and still had the same touch and taste and smell and probably wine as well. Your wine is probably higher class than wine.
Well, don't you think it's interesting that the whole kind of 60s revolution seemed to be happening in bookshops all around the world? I mean, obviously you had City Lights in San Francisco, you had the Peace-Eye in New York, Shakespeare Company, and you know, as you were saying, Compendium as well as Better Books in London. And it seemed to be those places were amazing catalysts for things happening. And it attracted all these, you know, amazing, innovative people at the time doing all these really experimental things in bookshops. And I find
really
that quite
question.
fascinating.
Really good question. And the short answer is yes. The longer answer, I guess, is why would that be the case?
Yeah.
In the very, after I worked at the Unicorn, which was in the process of disintegrating, I set up another independent bookshop called the Public House Bookshop in an old Victorian public house, in case you missed the title. And in the early days, I was trying to work that question out myself. Like, what are we doing here?
Do you think it was linked to independent press and mail art and things that were happening at the time?
It was
Obviously, it's before internet and the easy way of, you know, getting word out there across the world and everything. It seemed to be the way of, getting
And
the information out there to people was the easiest way, maybe.
Even Stella got shocked with this. This is Jim Duke, who you will, I'll introduce you to a little bit later.
Yeah,
Jim Duke, handwriting his history of Dada. Okay? Jim Duke was the living embodiment of the Dada comment. Speaking of Roy, we saved you a seat, Roy, just here.
I'm here now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay. And you're near the wine. That's okay. That's really fine. We're talking about bookshops being, particularly in the 60s, being a catalyst for lots of artistic work and endeavors. The thing is this, there were formal institutions of learning.
Yeah.
Formal institutions, you know them. Some of you have even been to school, and you know the
formal
formal
galleries as well, actually, and theatre spaces.
Formal
there wasn't
galleries.
enough spaces for avant-garde things to be
And
happening.
what did they all have in common? They were organized around money principles.
Yeah.
Okay? All of them were organized as businesses to some degree. So their outputs were usually monetized. Bookstores almost were excuses for getting information out. The fact that you had to buy books, for example, in our bookstore, we never, ever, ever once in the history of 25 years prosecuted anyone for nicking books. Okay? Now you might have think that anti-commerce. Yes, it was, and I like your giggle. Now, it may have been that you got caught once or twice, but, okay, and
That's a guilty laugh.
yes,
Guilty
it
giggle.
certainly is. Never caught, well, you've been outed now. Okay, the thing is, did we catch lots of people? Of course. Some of the people were so bloody obvious. You know, like reading a book, oh, you could see the nodding on the head and then it would go in their handbag or their rucksack. And the proposition was always this, and all the people, it was organized around very cooperative principles, etc. We would all sort out at shop meetings what to do if something like that happened. We would always go up and ask, why did you nick that particular book? And if they gave a good enough definition, we gave it to them. Now look, she's going, I didn't nick
I always gave a good definition.
in a high-class bookstore. And that the business side of it, the money connection, was almost irrelevant. The idea was that it was like an anti-university before they were given a name. It was an alternative learning space. And that learning was multiplex, which is why in our basement we had a gallery, we had poetry readings, we had music, it was too crowded for dance, but we even had a Punch and Judy show downstairs.
Amazing.
During one celebration. Oh, do I want you to turn that? No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Let's say there was a really, really, really famous spillover inauguration peyote party on the first anniversary of our setting up that somehow spilled out over the weekend. Okay?
Wow.
It wasn't that we were inconsiderate about or didn't respect the huge possibility for learning. It was that it was an active place. And it was an active place that people came. And it might have been that was the first place I had a sit-down conversation with your dad.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to go through that. And we might as well talk about Jeff. I always remember the first conversation I had with him. He came in like, as I said, like a civil servant on holiday. No disrespect to civil servants or Jeff, in his very quiet spoken manner. And I saw him standing there, and I was having a conversation or two with people. We were discussing Russian formalism and the notion of montage as a way of defining action and emotion in films. Okay, you guys know the Kuleshov effect, etc., and all of that. So I was having a discussion. I don't remember whether it was pretentious or not, but we were having a serious and dedicated conversation about because the Russian cinema is actually one of the catalysts for the cinema that we know today. I mean, absolutely fundamentally important. And we were talking about how it had sort of become hijacked, I guess we were talking about, by the state and turned into propaganda vehicles. And I'll always remember your dad sitting there really quietly. And we used to have a chair or two in the kids section so they could sit down and would sit down. And he said, all film is propaganda.
Yeah.
That was it. And immediately my brain computed. And then it started to, like his films, spread out. What he had said resonated and repeated itself, because then I went, well, what if, and then, ooh, and then, and believe it or not, I was speechless. Believe it or not.
But I remember, for instance, those dinners we used to go around to at Lee Harvey's,
yeah,
where we'd sit and have the most amazing conversations, all of us. It was just fantastic. And it would go off like that, like you said. You'd start with a simple statement like that, but it would go off into all these different kind of amazing.
And you could
travels
do
all over
that
the
because
place.
it was a private conversation. Because
Yeah.
your dad was a really private person.
Yeah.
Even though he
And that's
seems,
even more amazing as well when you see his work too.
yeah, I mean, his work is explosive and is, what's the Borges phrase? A circle whose circumference is nowhere and everywhere. Because his stuff just goes out and out and out and out. He wanted to escape the frame. Whether it's the frame of the artwork, nothing intended here, the frame of the artwork, or the frame of the cinema.
But that's true anarchy spirit, isn't it? Because it's, any kind of repression or authoritarianism or whatever. That's
Or limitation.
Yeah.
We go, psh, hence the A-frame, okay? Get an A-frame. And it's down on writing, so you can't avoid this in the future. Those conversations, like I remember them fondly with Lee Harwood, his Brighton poet, etc., really superb poet. They would be open spaces for conversation because we were among friends. And Jeff was really at ease, and they were always, as you say, augmentative. They would expand out. It was never any debate. It was always about what would be more interesting question or more interesting subject. They just flowed out like food. It was just consumed and repeated back and always shared. The public spaces, he was a little bit more reserved in.
Yes, yeah.
Unless
he was very shy, wasn't he? I think.
Yeah. And you might see, from the framework or the lovely poster over there, thinking, was this madman? Yes, he was creatively mad, intensely mad. And when he put on the mask, when he put on the costume, when he became the varieties of Dr. Gaz or others, there was an ability to take on every persona. And especially when he did it with his Dada poet friend, Jim Duke.
Mm.
Do you want to say a little bit about Jim?
Well, Jim was the bald guy in the films, if you've seen the films, and hopefully you will see them. He was an amazing performer, a natural performer, wasn't he? Very gifted and very charismatic, but also a fantastic poet. And he was over here just for 4 years, actually, in the 60s, from Melbourne in Australia. And then he moved back. But it was an incredibly intense, rich 4 years. And my dad and him just hit it off instantly because they were both intellectual anarchists, basically, and they just were totally simpatico, weren't they?
Yeah.
And they kept a friendship until Jim's death and had amazing letters. They illustrated all these letters and sent collage material to each other and all kinds of marvellous stuff. And just a very rich friendship that was very deep, I think, and very fruitful.
And
Great collaboration.
It was great collaboration because you'll see him in all of Jeff's early films. And my particular emphasis is always on Jeff's films because that's how I experienced him, rather than just seeing these particular pieces of artwork. Once you start seeing Jeff's films, you'll realize that even all of these artworks are like, the analogy is a single frame of a film that goes on let's just say, that rolls on indefinitely. And they compound one another. They're absolutely interactive and explosive. And Jim Duke as a persona, as I said, was explosive. They were like chalk and cheese. Quiet spoken, very careful with his language. Even in some of Jeff's films, you'll see, destroy the word, or, subdue the word, break the word. Why? Because words limit. And so he would use them very carefully. So they had resonances, like all film is propaganda, which still resonates with me today. Jim Duke, on the other hand, part of this incredible Brighton context. That's why I'm here. I'm just to fill in the gaps, which is the context that Jeff was working out of all of his life, or all of his adult life, was incredibly varied and fundamentally transgressive. I first came across Jim Duke when, one of the other aspects of Brighton at the time is it had one of the first art slams in the country.
Yes.
Brighton Combination.
Yeah.
I don't know whether...
They performed there, didn't they?
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, we did a Rayman. It's hard to give the word to it without limiting. Let's just say performance. And Jim Duke performed there on his own once, which is the first time I met him. By the way, the Brighton Combination was Arts Lab type, an open space for, they had a cooperative company where decisions were made collectively, directorships rotated amongst all of the actors, and the theatre was basically a black box that was twice this size, where the audience just sat everywhere and we performed. It was one of the things that I got involved in when I first came here.
I didn't realise you were involved in it, actually.
Yeah, well, it was Jenny Harris,
Yeah.
who founded the Brighton Combination, who went on to found the Albany Empire and various Deptford Empire and combinations as well. She was the one who told me about the job at the Unicorn, the famous encounter with the kimono, the short kimono.
Yeah.
Jenny lived in Brighton, but worked in London, and I came across her. The short stories, I came across her through various activities. We'd have to shut that off again. No, not those other activities. They were other activities. And she just said, look, there's a bookstore that really wants someone who knows American literature, etc., and blah, blah. And I said, yeah, that would be great. Because when I first came here, I couldn't get a work permit. I was offered a job watering flower boxes at night. That was the height of
That's
my
very
day.
specific.
Yeah, I still remember it. I didn't know whether to smile or spit. And when I spoke to Jenny about this stuff, she just said, look, a friend of mine who was butler had this job opening. Did I want to try for it? And I said yes. But because I was new to London and I was living in Clapham Junction, when she said Brighton, I kind of misheard it. I looked on a map. For those of you, this was pre-digital. You couldn't just Google it and go, okay, this is where it is. And I misread Brighton for Brixton. And because I was in Clapham Junction and I saw Brixton was next door, I thought, this will be a double. And so I came for the interview, and then I actually looked on a map and I saw it was 50 miles away. So I had to jump on a train and come to Brighton. And then the rest, as I say, is history. I came in and I discovered this intense oasis, but it wasn't disconnected from the world. There was lots of aliens like myself here. Yes, I used to be called an alien.
I mean, it sounds
by the
like
way.
Brighton was as amazing then as it is now in terms of, the amount of creativity here and stuff. Because my memory of Brighton, as I was growing up, from 65 onwards, obviously, is that it was actually quite a run-down little seaside resort that didn't. I mean, it had all these pockets of creative people living here, but it didn't seem cohesive in that sense. But maybe that was just the.
Well, that was probably from your child's eye view.
Yeah.
It's like, they're all big people and I don't like them.
Yes.
The thing is,
But it sounds like there was quite a scene already, is what I'm saying.
part
A
of its
cultural
rundown
scene.
glory meant that it was cheap.
cheap
And you
for
could-
artists.
you
It's
could-
always the way, isn't
I
it?
mean, I lived in Clapham Junction before it became a tour de force. I lived in Clapham Junction when there were street markets selling bacon for 2 and 6. Okay, I remember that. And I also remember the signs in newsagents' windows that said no colours.
God,
I also remember that. And it was a really cheap place to live. Brighton was at that time as well, because its tourist glory days had kind of passed, and it had, gotten kind of run down. I just saw it as beautiful, and inviting and capable. Now it's like much of the country, it's been gentrified. There are still pockets, probably outside of Brighton. Many of its creative energies have been translated into digital. Translated into digital media, not just film, but all the kinds of interpenetration of media. Because one of the beautiful things about digital is that it links cohesively a whole range of single mediums. If your dad was alive today, he'd be working in digital.
Yeah, definitely. He was always keen to experiment and all these, latest technologies and stuff.
He had to invent digital.
Yeah.
He did. He invented a manual form of digital.
Yeah, I guess he did.
Yeah, he could eat and dissolve and multiplex, and he could layer it on, and he could make it all come out at the same time. These days, he would be working on, VR, and would be setting himself up instantaneously. And by the way, he never left the film. You'll see him in it, but when it came to showing the films, remember, this is on celluloid, which is pre-digital, just in case. It's like a book, it doesn't have any batteries, but it actually runs, so it runs on machines, has to be projected. Sometimes he would use multiple projectors.
The sound of those was quite cacophonous. In a small space, it would be quite...
Oh, I remember it, because in Trafalgar Street, there was that studio. I don't know whether it was John Upton's studio. That's where I first saw some of his presentations.
Well, they did some exhibitions in empty shops around Brighton, didn't they? As well as using bookshops as spaces to...
Wherever was available, they would
working.
use it, because it was the stuff that they did, not the white walls. And in the showing of the films, now imagine 1 or 2 8mm or 60mm projectors. They've got a physical reality. They have a sound. They're always noisy. And Jeff would be probably in some form of costume. He would be walking in between the projectors, and he'd be walking in front of the screen. He'd adjust the projectors. He might stop one and fiddle with the film, and so on. You were always present and always aware that movement never stopped. And that's one of the classic things about Jeff. Mm. And I sat down, and this has been a great invitation, because I went through half of his film output. He made a lot of films. Jeff would never stop.
Yeah.
He was one of those things that was... touch paper you lit when he was maybe 7, and he just carried on until the end. He was always working. And in his films, like if you intuit from many of these artworks, they never stop. His films are always in motion. And I'm not talking about trick photography. Even though he would use some cinematic techniques, he would overlay his films. He would double expose, triple expose, quadruple expose. He would take the film stock. This was physical stuff for those who haven't used celluloid before. And he would swap cameras. After he shot the films, he would swap cameras and shoot them again from a completely different perspective, maybe a different film that he was working on. And the intensity of both the presentation and the entropy that's involved in multiple impressions was continued. The shooting, this is what I mentioned earlier, the shooting of the films was only one step. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like you shoot the films and then go into post-production like today. Post-production is one step before you exhibit them and take the money. Jeff's films were never part of a box office chain. They were never linked to producers and money men and so on. They were always totally self-originated.
But also he was turning it into a kind of performative thing, it sounds like. You know, like you were saying about him moving around the projectors while people were sitting like this, you know, watching things. It would be a very performative thing where he was in the films, but also in your face, in the room, and
Absolutely.
you know, you're part of the whole experience kind of thing. It's a
This
multi-sensory overload, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, multi-sensory, if you look at that, close your eyes. I'm not going to do anything mean or nasty, I promise I won't move, okay? Close your eyes, what can you see? And don't tell me nothing, because you will always see something. If we were to open the windows and you felt a rush of air with your eyes closed, you would experience the air differently than you would with your eyes open. If I asked you to get up and shake yourself out or do the storyteller's thing, I also worked for a long time as a storyteller. I would say, okay, let's do a storyteller's warm-up. You pull your ears, you're losing your tongue. Why? Because to any storytelling, you need to bring your body, because the stories are embodied in the performance. Jeff embodied film rather than shot film and kept it as a memory. Nothing could be further from the truth. The film was only one step. These are frames. They would all be put together, remixed, elemented, and reused. I saw some early stuff that got reused 10 years later.
Yeah.
And things. Oh, by the way, this has got to do with the metaphor for storytelling. When you do storytelling, you have to arrive with clean ears, loose tongue, and an open mind. You bring the open mind, the storyteller brings everything else. So, and Jeff was primarily storytelling, but in multiple languages. If you look at some of his directly autobiographical films, by the way, the answer to all films are propaganda, except when they're autobiographical. Then they're just about biography. And Jeff's films are all autobiographical because he's the single unique point in all of the films. His own creativity. Hi.
Sorry we're late.
But that's okay, this is England, we're used to it.
Let's put them over there instead.
Okay, we'll do the logistics. And there you go.
So don't you think there's an importance now, when we're so used to experiencing everything online, and we're so distanced from real life, don't you think it's really important to kind of get back to this spirit, the free spirit?
I think there is lots of people
People
using
like yourselves and my dad and all these other people we're working with all the time, just to, very openly, you know.
Well-
it was very open and free then, wasn't it?
Well, let's say it was more open and free because, for example, we didn't have to negotiate media companies. Jeff made this thing with a 16mm camera and an 8mm camera. And for a whole range of time, 8mm Super 8s were like a godsend. This, when I showed you that this was done by an anarchist printer and done in Letraset with Gestetner, handwritten, all kinds of things. Why? Because the significant change in that period was about the means of production. Now, I'm not talking like a Marxist analyst. The means of production became accessible.
Yeah.
So the rise of
It was
video,
relatively cheap, wasn't it, to get things printed and sent out all over the place abroad?
it was simpler and cheaper. And one of the reasons, again, why bookshops were at the heart of some of the movements is all you had to have is a duplicator, and you were a publisher. And these things coincided. You know, the rise of 16mm and Super 8s, the rise of Gestetner, even Letraset was part of a revolution, particularly in the States, where you had no access to the large-scale presses. And again, people working now, there are these free spirits. Digital operations, because technically they put more power, and for those of you who can't see it, I'm pointing to John's iPhone. There's more power in an iPhone than in the Hollywood studios of the golden era. And I'm talking about the entire technology. where you can actually film, you can storyboard, you can edit, you can process, you can distribute in that one vehicle. So there are people out there. It's just that they're working in a saturated field, okay, where there's loads of media platforms that are trying to sell this, and therefore the distinctions are blurred about what your intentions are. Jeff's intentions were always clear. He didn't give a toss about the film distribution. He didn't give a toss about producers and so on. It's a misnomer to call him a filmmaker in that sense that filmmakers are part of a guild with skills to live by. Jeff was an artist who lived by film as a creative medium. It's like talking about, oh, what do you do? Oh, I work on paper. I shouldn't say, because some people say they work on paper. I work on paper, I work on canvas. Jeff worked on celluloid, but it wasn't the means of production. He used that to capture his artwork in action. Now would be a brilliant time to watch one of his short films. If we can't do that, I'm not going to act it out. One of the good things about Jeff's films is you cannot take them away with you, except in your head. You cannot even describe them. And when it comes to trying to describe Jeff's films, I'm kind of lost. Okay, wow, we're moving into the streets.
What do you think about the level of censorship that's going on at the minute with everything? It's like, you know, coming from that background though, and the freedom that was just in your bookshop alone, you know, the freedom of expression. I just wonder what you felt about the way things have gone.
Okay,
now
let's.
Kind of new Puritanism, it seems.
It's a good question, but it's too general to be able to answer.
It is a good question.
Right, let's put it in context. I'll put it in a very specific context. Yes, we were acting as if censorship didn't matter. The public house bookshop was firebombed twice. We had our windows smashed 9 times. And there was column 88, death squad, that came in to kill me.
Yeah.
So that's a different form of censorship.
It really is very intense, yeah.
You're talking about kind of maybe state censorship and cultural censorship and so on. There's always cultural censorship. None of the studios, propaganda again, work free of the propaganda of making money because they all see the notion of movies as product. So they sell them. That's a censorship in its own right. There's a long tradition in England, I've discovered, as an observer. Okay, I still sit on the fence sometimes, of independent filmmaking in these film societies that would gather together and they would sit in a room like this and show one another's films. And at first when I heard about it, I thought, it's a bit like amateur theatrics. It was actually more heartfelt than that. I found that some of the film societies still exist because they don't want to sell their films. They don't want to have that censorship of control at the gate, you know, where the money actually counts beforehand and at the end. Jeff would make, how long did he make films for? 38 years, 40 years? He's made one continuous film. He just would cut them up. Some of his films, by the way, he would literally cut them up. 200 feet, clip, put a title on it, and that's a film. Clip. It's not sausage machine like you might have in a studio. It's about the notion that the creative process is continuous. So they can't be discreetly labeled. Oh, this is a genre film, this is a zombie film, this is a science fiction film, this is, it's my notebook. Because he talks about keeping of his journals. That's because they were autobiographical. He was always in a, Jackie, your mom, they had a little discussion about Muse. She was much more than a muse. She was an amazing collaborative partner. Like Jim Duke was a collaborative partner. And your next door neighbors were collaborative partners. Why? Because they were in the orbit of Jeff's working. I was in the orbit, there were a number of other people who would come and go, because Brighton was a movable feast. And depending on where he shot and who he asked and who turned up on the day, he would create his movable feasts. And still now, even though when you look at, for example, maybe some of the architecture or some of the cars, you compute a date, the rest of it, Jeff's contributions to it, are not time-bound.
Mm-hmm.
They are just multiple flashes of reality now simultaneously cast.
They still look as fresh now as when they were first made. It's
And
amazing.
again, thanks to the BFI. No, I'm not trying to get the commission. Thanks to the BFI for their thing. Look, I've got something that I kind of fetched out, if I can find it. I put it down in my, oh yeah. You can tell this isn't a nostalgic exercise because I have to find my bloody glasses.
The other glasses.
Yeah, my other glasses. Not the one I drink out of, but the one I kind of read from. There's this quote. Listen, one of the things you've heard me, you've heard Stella, you've heard John at a distance. This is Jeff. And I think it would be nice to introduce his voice here. And I've got some quotes. I like quotes because they're a little bit like his artwork. You have to come to terms with them rather than provide your own framework. You can provide your own interpretations, but the quotes are basically an insight into how he's thinking. This was Jeff in that exhibition in 1977. I don't know whether it was shoot. It was. This is his quote. About his cinema, about his films. Comic strips of life, a theater of the brain, a secret cinema of tableau, jokes, and mysteries that will, God, my eyesight's going too, that will finally embrace both the emblem, i.e. the visual residual that you see there, and the natural world. Jeff was deeply connected to the natural world. The tip was a natural world with all of the detritus of the urban landscape dumped there, not built over. The natural world. Your dad started as an illustrator of birds and various
other things. Gardener.
Yeah. He was always conscious of a natural world, i.e. one that maybe intervened with, but not given over. So his themes about life and death, sex and entropy and passion and mythologies in urban landscapes were always dispossessed from urban landscapes. Where else could you have zombies, ray guns, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the same place? In Brighton, yes. In Jeff's films, they all coexist. Therefore, you scratch one surface, like he would also, mess with the film and scratch it, you would get to see layers and layers, and they would all move. When you watch his films, be prepared because you cannot stop the action. It's always, 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 always in motion. So you think you're sitting here quietly. We're always in motion. We're in motion inside, we're in motions. Again, the sensory thing is all of us here are heart beating, pulsing. We've got 27 different time frames in our brain. We've got different tastes, different memories from the morning, maybe a little indigestion from having too much curry last night and beer. We're multiplex organisms that are active in many different layers. Jeff merely expanded that out, used the lens to capture the process, and then would always build upon it. Which is why I never get the feeling that any of his films end.
No.
Sometimes they just go, beep,
Yes.
okay? I don't know if any of you watch films. I mean, go to the commercial cinemas to watch films. Simple game is, okay, credits roll, what happens next? If the film engages you enough to ask what happens next, then chances are you've had some level of immersion. With Jeff's films, you either are totally immersed or you go make lunch. And being totally immersed, the film doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. It will become part of your neural synapses. Okay? And that's why, as you pointed out, they don't have a date, because as long as we're living and breathing, we don't have a date as well. Enjoy them when you discover them. By the way, the other quotes on here, I've already gotten the old film as propaganda. Blake, if there has to be an empathetic soul, a compatible spirit, it's William Blake. Because there's two quotes that came to mind when I got your email saying, let's do this. Better to murder an infant in its cradle. What comes next? Come on. There's got to be some Blakeans amongst you. Better to murder an infant in its cradle than to suppress a natural desire. There was no suppression. There may have been repression in Jeff's films, but it was about unlimited expression. And the other one, which I really love, and I'm going to, well, Blake's out of copyright, I can use it. Exuberance, like this is anti-Keats. Exuberance is beauty. If you want a description for your dad's film, his exuberance is absolutely beautiful in that sense of being fundamentally striking and fundamentally alive. Mm-hmm. Oh, and there was another quote. If you don't mind, I'll read the quote out. It's called Answers, and I jotted it down. You can see I jotted. Answers. I wrote these down as answers to your questions, which you haven't given me. So I've written a list of answers, so if they answer your question, don't ask. Okay? Jeff. Anarcho-Zen, Blakean, surreal comic artist, spontaneous combustion, unleashed, gas, gaze, daz, jazz, the number 42. A complete history of the universe and everything. Comic book hero and beyond the frame. So those are the answers. You don't need to ask the question. Yes, Jeff is all of those things. Okay, that's me.
Are there any questions from the audience? I'm sure there must be. Dare I ask?
Stella, could you give us a view of what it was like within the family, but also within the kind of functioning group of a filmmaking unit?
How do you mean? What?
Because you were involved in making the films. Your mum was there, of course. Richard's talking about friends being brought in as well. What was it like? How did it function in that sense?
In terms of the filmmaking process, or how he was working generally?
No, in terms of the filmmaking.
Yeah, the filmmaking. I mean, it was always treated as fun. I mean, I was going to pick up actually on that quote with the reference to it's jokes and mysteries, which is really going back to surrealism and Dada, and it was that spirit. You know, it was a very party kind of spirit when we made the films. I'm sure you remember anyway. You know, it was it was all a bit of a tea party, really. It was treated like that. As I think I've said before, they were mainly made over the weekends because most people involved were working in the week or whatever. And it was basically treated as a kind of picnic where everyone was dressing up in wild outfits and, you know, making a bit of a movie. And it was very open and free and fun, great fun, fantastic. There was nothing ever feeling kind of dark or serious in that sense, even though he was a deep thinking, serious individual. He had that sense of fun with everything that he did, and that was how it came across all the time. And that's the spirit of Dada, really, isn't it? And surrealism.
It's certainly, particularly
that element
Dada.
of play and chance happening from play and all kinds of things like that.
I think I'll tell you the story about Jim. Oh, I told you. I didn't tell you.
Oh, didn't you?
No, I don't think so. The first time I met Jim Doon, who is the personification of Dada, he is in Jeff's films, and he could do that 1920s thing where he steps out of the screen, okay? Literally untrammeled, untouched, and be that persona. here. It was at the Brighton Combination, again, a pretty anarcho place. Except it taught me to hate muesli. But that's another story. We made so much goddamn muesli. Oh, God. I felt like double toil in trouble. Okra. But that's a cooperative theater. Anyway, Jim Duke was performing. But I didn't realize it was Jim Duke performing because we were sitting in, there was a cafeteria area, which was nothing but tables and chairs. And suddenly, this guy got up. Now, Jim was smallish of stature, balding, even though he was, I think he was only 27, 26, something like that at the time. Balding, and he stood up, and it looked like he had a homemade crown on his head. You know, a wooden kind of paraphrase, not a crown of thorns. It was less skillful than that. It was just this carapace that he wore on his head. And then he started reciting his poetry, which mainly consisted of, at the start, da 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 da, and that went on for about 5 minutes. Okay, well, it's better than the muesli. And then I was watching it, and it became hypnotic because then there would be words and growls and movements associated with it. He became a larger, amorphous figure, and part of Dada is breaking the word and breaking the formula, not just breaking the stanza line. It was breaking everything for the raw creative spirit that's at the heart of creativity. Okay? Creativity in action, I called it. And he went on like this for the time, kind of, it didn't freeze. It became irrelevant. So it was here. And then, at the end of it, I found out the crown. It was a band of fireworks, and he lit it.
Oh my God.
And his head started exploding, and the fireworks were shooting out and stuff, and he was screaming, da 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 da. It was only afterwards that he found out that he'd actually burned his scalp.
He must have done.
Yeah, he set fire to his scalp, and he had 3rd-degree burns. So some of the dada had a different kind of impulse to it. And you know what they say? You had to be there.
You really did.
Yeah,
I wish I'd been there to see that. My God.
Well, it's there. It's there. Remember I said about
You don't
this
forget
embedded
something
memories?
like that, really.
No, you don't
Wow,
forget
that's
it.
awesome.
And every time I had muesli from then on, I thought of that. And it was a great way to wean ourselves off because we had it because it was cheap food. And that was my introduction. And you might think, okay, for those of you who happen to be therapists or social workers or even worse, teachers, that, okay, he's borderline personality disorder, yada, 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 yada. One time Jim came around. I can't remember the purpose. There was one of the things about Brighton as an open space, the cultural open spaces, is that our doors weren't locked. I mean, people turned up on your door, and you're like, oh, yeah, fine, open it up. You met people in the toilet and stuff, oh, hi. And he's, okay, and you never gave it any second thought. Jim came around, and we must be talking books, because I think he was working on some stuff with an anarchist printer called Ted Kavanaugh, who went to Australia after here. And Jim, who was always moving around, he was kind of like a very nervous type. There was a chessboard in the corner of the flat I was living in, and he just went, oh, you play chess? To be honest, I didn't play chess because I didn't enjoy it very much, but I had a friend who would come around and we'd play chess, but he would get very pissed off or nervous and stuff, and it would end up a fight and go away. And I said, well, sort of. And he said, do you want to play? And I went, yeah, sure. I didn't know that Jim, in his fireworks pyrotechnic way, was also Australian junior chess champion.
He was.
And here I was, this naive American, oh yeah, let's just play, shall we? But not the side of play that your father was talking about, that Jeff played with me. So I remember setting up the board, and we set up the pieces, and before I realized it, the game was over. And I went, oh, okay, maybe I didn't concentrate. I still had some personal vanity about being able to play chess. So we set him up again, 17 moves. And for those of you who don't know chess, that was like, it'll be really fine, wasn't it? And it was over again. And I've never played chess since. And if Jazz, as he's now known in Australia, were to be here, he couldn't be here because I think he passed away last year, is that I would thank him for ridding me of any kind of addiction to chess, which, like golf, is pretty much a waste of time. But that's another story. I forget how we got there, but this is Brighton, so we got there by any door that was open.
Yeah. Well, it did seem that 14 St Michael's Place was a hubbub of activity for, all these, well, St Michael's Place as a street seemed to be full of artists living there.
Yeah, then, because it was dirt cheap.
Yeah.
It was owned by...
It was Hoogstraten or
Yeah.
Rackman or one of them, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
one of the Rackman landlords. Brighton has had a number of those, and you've named a couple.
Yeah.
Hoogstraten was so notorious. Some friends of mine lived in one of his flats, and he literally sent 2 henchmen around.
Yeah.
Who they came in through the kitchen window while my friends were in the house.
Crazy.
And they took sledgehammers to their living room wall.
Wow.
While they were there, tum, and then just quietly said, "We'll be back," and left because they were trying to get them out. Because it was
Threatening thing to get them out.
It was a controlled rent,
Wow.
and they wanted to do them up and sell the building. They moved.
Incredible.
My friends moved because
Yeah.
they were serious. Anyway, those are some of the pockets that we had to live in as well, to put up with the cheap accommodation, and let's call it the open spirit. Not everyone shared in that. There's still landlords like that today.
Yeah.
Roy.
Questions, anyone?
Can I talk about the film process of filming, in particular the soundtrack?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it already, but as I
We haven't really talked
recall,
about the sound stuff.
I recall with Jeff is that he painted the soundtrack as it went along. Is that right?
Wow. What, you mean he actually was scratching on the
Yeah.
sound?
Yeah.
Reels
and
and-
little, and paint and do a little bit. The whole thing as it went along, after it being produced,
Yeah.
he then painted a bit of sound into it every frame, 10 frames, 6 frames.
Wow.
Did we come across that at all?
We haven't really kind of looked seriously at his experimental sound work, and that was a whole thing in itself, wasn't it? Which kind of tied in with the noise performance that you were talking about with jazz as well.
Given that the films were often duplicated, several different, added together,
Yeah.
he then did the sounds afterwards. That's why very different. There's not a normal kind of sound situation.
No,
The
again, like the
is
film, it's
different
very
to the picture.
multi-layered.
The picture
isn't
is
it?
a Harvard and the pictures after a while. And that's why I understood it. That's
Yeah.
how I thought it was done.
I don't know. I was
And
there and I don't
again,
know.
for those of you who are used to taking film on your iPhone, there was no sound in the Super 8s that were shot at the time. So they were all silent films, and many of Jeff's early films are silent. Later on, when when they were transferred back to 16mm and sound could be added, some external sound would be added. Jeff had a really nice line in romantic 1930s songs as well. That's on some of his clips. The word fearless is the kind of overused journalistic cliche. If you use it in Jeff's context, considering what we've said about his persona, very quiet, very thoughtful, a lot of care and attention, and then when the exuberance took over, the creative spirit was embodied. That creative spirit was fearless. Okay?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be limited by the frame, whether that frame was official, cultural, social, personal, in any mode. He would expand that frame, expand it, or if it didn't want to expand, just quietly destroy it with a blowtorch or a hammer or an iron, anything domestic. He was not an international terrorist. he was
Actually, that's
local.
reminded me of Gustav Metzger as well, because he was really influenced by him, and Gustav came down to Brighton, and I wasn't sure if he'd come to your bookshop.
No, I
actually.
don't remember his visits. There were so many people who came and went.
Because there were some amazing artists who came to your bookshop, like
Yeah.
Stefan Themerson, and obviously there's that visit by, what's
Yes.
his name? Not Brackage, what am I talking about? Oh my god, the beat writer. His
What,
name was
Allen
Yes,
Ginsberg?
Ginsberg.
Yeah.
All that.
There were. It was a very usual thing for many. I don't know about international artists, but for many European artists, Brighton was a kind of fun play capital that they thought, let's go for a weekend, like you still do, to Brighton. So they would combine a kind of cultural journey with just tasting the seaside life. And at that time, I mean, it was great. Parts of the seafront were 24 hours.
But they came to visit and did readings in
They
your
came to
bookshop,
visit, do
didn't they?
readings, etc. We put on.
Did Burroughs come?
Yeah, Burroughs
Yeah.
was often in
Cool.
Brighton, particularly at the Unicorn, and he came down later. He came down to the public house, and Ginsberg. We put him on a couple of times, and Ginsberg was very sweet. We have some photos which I can talk to you about. We'll put up with your other collections. When he said the bookshop was better than city lights. Now,
That's
allowing
a
a little bit of an exaggeration and stuff, but remember,
That's
Ginsberg was a Buddhist. He didn't have to lie, okay? He wasn't going to get to heaven because of it or hell. Yeah, I mean, that the ambiance is very hard to describe because it's not fixed. It wasn't defined. There was no membership. You didn't pay dues except personally. And the legacy is that, well, Jeff had antecedents. I mean, you know, like Stan Brakhage and various other things who he appreciated, and Cizou in France, and other people who actually approached the film, the medium, as an artist would another form of media, canvas, paper, whatever. So it all went through the frame of the camera and came out the other side to be processed continuously. And those times have changed because cinema has become much more of an industry. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping, as I said before, it's breaking down with access to means of production. So millions of people are actually working, and maybe when the DREC gets sorted out, there will also be people like your dad and like artists everywhere who are using it as a flexible medium to illuminate people's lives rather than merely to leap into their pockets and get likes online.
Yeah.
So, any questions? You guys have been very patiently sitting
Yes, and it's quite cold in here, so I'm
there.
sorry.
Yeah, and I can see some of you eyeing the door thinking, like, can I jump over all these people and, do a leg? Let's take a couple of questions.
When was you first aware that mum and dad weren't run-of-the-mill mum and dad? and was you, when your friends around that time?
It was really when I went to school.
Did they
Before
suddenly,
school,
was you a
that
little bit
was my
embarrassed
normal.
about mum and dad in the early days?
It's funny, I mean, as you grow up, you do go through an embarrassed phase.
Yeah.
My embarrassed phase was like, I think it was 12, 13.
Yeah.
When you start to you go through the change, don't you? And you start to kind of move towards the teenage years. And that's when I felt a bit kind of awkward and embarrassed about it all, really. I went through a short phase. But then I got back into it again and was, from 14 onwards, was doing experimental sound work at live performances with my dad and stuff like that. So, basically, when I went to school, I realised that my life wasn't normal at all. And that was quite a weird adjustment. And I was bullied a lot, of course.
Yeah, of course.
And because I was from a poor background as well, and was wearing second-hand clothes a lot as a kid, you get mercilessly bullied at school. So I learned from early on to kind of handle myself, and usually by making people laugh. And I think the humour thing is a really important thing in life generally, but also in art, and it's something it's never taken seriously, is it? Humour is never taken seriously in art, and it's something that really frustrates me, because it was a really important part of his work.
There's humour. Everything.
And I think, it's how we cope with life, isn't it? So much.
Well, there's alcohol if you
Oh, yes.
um, and working, and I also work as a therapist, so I know a lot of people go to that one first and humor last. The thing about, just as another observation, another level of observation, again, we could probably go on all day trying to honestly and transparently describe the body, the corpus of his films. It's an impossible task. One other strand that's a kind of trope is humor is abundant in his films, but you don't recognize it as humor. You don't see it as a genre. It's never a setup. It doesn't use language, for one thing. And
there's quite a few puns in it all, though, aren't there?
There's
play on words.
There's plays on words, there's plays on characters. All of his characters are plays on comic strips or other kinds of tableaus, other sources that he will play and manipulate. Jim Duke's character, the mock Hitler one, what did he call it?
Mottler, which is a play on Hitler. Yeah. And it's a whole thing about how Hitler burned the books, obviously, and you know,
so there's book burning, film burning, and the usual joys of government. What was I saying? Something. The strands. What's important about the strands, the tropes, the themes, if you were running an art studies course, which, oh, there was another giggle down there. Is it from the shoplifter? Good. My God, you've got a multitude of sins that you carry with you here. By the way, I teach film studies for my tenants as well. So, okay. Yeah, you would tease out these things, but like Greek drama, comedy and tragedy are absolutely intermixed and indistinguishable. They can't be separated out without killing the body. And in Jeff's thing, he will throw this out. You don't actually need to pick it up because you will empathetically absorb it. His films are about absorption as well as celebration. And comedy, tragedy, whole range. Second World War in 30 seconds, for example, not cheap journalism, but extraordinarily resonant with the images and our own experience of them. No viewer is separate from the film. And that is astonishing filmmaking. I can't think of very many other people who use film. I wouldn't even call it filmmaking, because most filmmakers are like Orson Welles once said, any fool can write a book, but it takes an army to make a film. Jeff was his own army, but he had plenty of volunteers.
Yes.
Okay? And you will be the volunteers if you actually choose to watch one of his films. You will be in the brigades. So all I can say is welcome. Yeah. Let's do a film night here sometime.
That'd be my pleasure. That'd be really great.
An idea?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard.
Shall we? Any more questions? If not, we'll end it on a positive note in the future. Oh, we got more questions. Roy.
Are there any stories of him taking simple home movies that people on demand? People are saying that I'm having a funeral or a wedding. Can you take it from us? A bit like going to a party.
Oh, you mean was he booked to film particular events?
He'd be the photographer, you know.
Yeah. No, he never was actually. I mean,
because I met somebody who said, well, my wife, we had a wedding, and he filmed it.
Oh, that might have been Nick and Liz's wedding in Lewis, maybe.
Somebody else. So there is elements, there is control, there is any honest. Is there any, how do you say, evidence?
I can't imagine he would have ever made a straight film like that. I mean,
Yeah, he never
may have
would have
taken bits of films that he took, you know, of other people's events or whatever, and then incorporated them into his films. But
he wouldn't have done it as a commercial.
No.
That's not to be true, he did, I'm sure.
Gosh.
Well, there's one or two, because I thought that was part of his. He managed to get a bit of money by filming other people's weddings and stuff like that.
No, he worked as a gardener for the local council here for quite a few years, and as a postman, and of course Lee Harwood was in the post office as well. And then he kind of went round and did a lot of lecturing and stuff and showing his films and stuff in art colleges and universities. So he kind of got by with things like that. And he got a lot of funding, actually, amazingly. I say amazingly because it's bloody impossible, isn't it?
Later on.
But yeah, he did manage to get funding. He had some sympathetic ears, I think, at the Arts Council and stuff.
By the way, Jenny,
oh yeah,
invited me, that story that you heard before, worked on the Arts Council.
Oh, did she? Oh wow, so she did a lot of
Roy,
stuff.
can you quickly just tell us what your connection with Jeff? Can you tell us what your connection with Jeff is?
We used to, once or twice, there was a, I don't know if you've mentioned already, but there was an organisation called the Brighton Head and Freaks magazine. I don't know who knows about it, but there's 4 or 5 issues in it, and using that rodeo and all that lot. And at the same time, there was a poetry readings on the seafront where the fishing museum is. Once or twice on a Sunday after the Sailing Army did a
yeah, because there was a Brighton anarchist group that were doing readings and stuff down there.
And there would be, but Jeff, I never saw Jeff doing anything there. That was all Jim Duke and Phil Upton and that lot. And so that's how that little group of people were with Jeff through the.
And Jim, your brother, printed some of my dad's works and stuff.
He did, yeah.
To fill in the background about Brighton, twin brothers, okay, Roy and Jim, were also responsible for Aloes Books, which is a fine, what we would call very independent press for many, many, many years. It published a whole range of interesting writers, especially poets. So there's a context here by part of the association of the Greater Brighton Cultural Front.
Can you just give a kind of a time period for that?
Well, from my experience of the time period is the late 1960s till the present day. It still continues, okay, in some of its many octopi forms. You had a question. You had
I was just thinking about the depth of Jeff's work, and there's quite a lot of animation going on where he animated his paintings and things, and that was all, I think it was all hand rendered. I was just wondering of the kind of scale, how the time scale it would take for him to produce one of his
It's
films.
incredibly laborious. I remember he had a little rostrum, his kind of homemade rostrum camera set up on the table all the time. And he just, every day he'd be like, click, click, and he'd have the clicker there, and he'd just be he'd move a bit of collage stuff around and then click, click, and it would just be really time consuming over weeks and weeks. He'd just kind of build up all these kind of bits of film, and then there was an incredible painstaking time of editing where he would be really down to like frame by frame editing, and I remember him just sitting working for hours and hours just editing these things really intensely. So even though it looks like it's quite randomly thrown together, there's a hell of a lot of work has gone into them in terms of that attention to detail. And he was really initially inspired by seeing Disney, the early Disney stuff. That was, when he first saw that as a kid, that was the thing that just set him off on that whole track. Really.
I know you went to art college briefly, but were there any other mentors in the film work? That actually kind of introduced him to this, or was it entirely came to it himself?
His mum really loved westerns, so that kind of turned him onto the western, and Charlie Chaplin and those kind of early comedy things, the circus, there are all these kind of elements, the musical, opera. His parents really were amazingly artistic, even though they came from a very simple kind of rural background. So I think that inspired it initially, taking him to the movies and the theatre and stuff.
And just again, I seem like to be the commentator bridging the digital gap to the manual gap. For those of you who've put together films, edited films on like your iPhone, click, click, button. I'm not talking about the intellectual force behind it, I'm talking about the physical force. Celluloid film stock had to be cut
Yeah.
physically. So we're talking frame by frame.
Yeah.
That's an amazing. Imagine.
Especially when it's standard 8, which is like that. It's insane, you know, really.
You need a magnifying glass and kind of, you know, myopic vision and
Yeah.
bad eyes. Is you have to be dedicated. And if, again, another phrase, you know, he was the most dedicated creator who used film. Shall we?
We shall. Thank you. That was absolutely
Thank you.
marvelous. Thank you.